Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lisa Yon. She is an associate professor in zoo and wildlife medicine at the School of Veterinary Medicine and Science at the University of Nottingham in the UK. She is interested in the health, welfare, and conservation of captive and free-living wildlife, with a particular focus on elephants, which includes a One Health approach, and we're going to talk about that during the interview, looking at the interface between human/domestic animal/wildlife and their environment. So, Dr. Yon, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, getting into captive elephant well-being, and we're also going to talk about elephant well-being in general, not just for the captive ones, but what aspects of elephant behavioral ecology do you think play the most important role here when assessing their well-being?
Well, there are a lot of different aspects to assessing well-being or welfare, which can encompass the environment that they live in, the other animals that are present, but also when you're actually trying to assess them, there are both sort of physiological measures of welfare as well as behavioral ones. And I have focused in on the behavioral ones. That's a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last more than a decade. In collaboration with partners here in the UK zoos, but also with colleagues overseas as well.
Mhm. But I mean, is it different when we're trying to evaluate elephant welfare in captive settings versus in the wildlife, for example? I mean, do you evaluate it differently? Do you pay attention to different factors and parameters, for example?
You do in a way. The thing is that in order to figure out if elephants have a good well-being in captivity, very often we'll use their wild counterparts as a comparator. So we'll see if the elephants in captivity show similar behaviors to what we see in wild elephants, because obviously that's how they've evolved to live. So they're a good benchmark, as we call them.
And does it make a difference if, for example, they were born in the wild and then captured, or if they were born while captive? I mean, does it make a difference in terms of how well, for example, they adapt to being in a captive environment or not?
It does seem to, yes, it's a really good point actually, that the elephants that are born into captivity do seem to experience their environment in a different way from elephants that have been brought into captivity but started out their lives in the wild. And in some ways they seem to show better or poorer welfare, but it certainly is different.
Mhm. And I mean, generally speaking, what kinds of settings and facilities have you studied elephants in?
Well, quite a range, to be honest, over the years. I've been studying elephants, well, most of my adult life, to be honest, about 30 years now, which sounds amazing to even say. I don't know where the time has gone, but I've studied them in zoos, in safari parks, in various captive camps for use for tourism across Southern Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. And I've also had the privilege of studying them in the wild.
By the way, is there a particular reason why you decided to study elephants? I mean, was it just an accident, or was it, for example, because you think that studying elephants, they are, let's say, for example, a good animal model for understanding animal welfare in captive settings and in the wild? Uh, I mean, is that the reason, or is there another reason for it?
To be honest, I first decided to study elephants back when I first went to vet school at Cornell University, quite some years ago now. I knew that I wanted to study wildlife, but I hadn't quite decided exactly what to do. And I had the very good fortune of meeting an absolutely amazing scientist by the name of Katie Payne. And Katie is based at Cornell University, at the Laboratory of Ornithology. And she actually is the person who discovered that elephants use infrasound, these very low frequency sounds, to communicate. About a third of the communication that they have is infrasonic. And when I spoke to Katie, I said to her, I want to study wildlife. I'm kind of still trying to decide what I want to study. And she said, well, why don't you study elephants? There's a great deal we still don't know about them. And so we talked, and I read, and we talked some more. And before I knew it, I got hooked. And so I ended up starting my research on elephants back when I was still a vet student, and my enthusiasm has continued since then. They are an amazing animal to study, but actually, when we think about them in comparison to other captive animals, there are some things which absolutely are similar in terms of captive wildlife and what they need. But actually, elephants can be, in some ways, require different things in captivity than many other species, because they're very large and because they are very intelligent. They're very cognitively complex animals with very strong social bonds, living with family members and staying in communication with family members for most, if not all, of their lives. So they're very challenging in some ways, I think, to look after in captivity because of that.
Mhm. One of the questions I alluded to earlier was, I asked you why you decided to study elephants, because I was also trying to see if, for example, because of there being evolutionary continuities and biological continuities, if, for example, it just so happened that elephants would be a good animal model to study welfare, and then to have some sort of way of comparing them to other animals that are also in captive states or in the wild, in terms of their welfare, of course.
Well, I mean, I think certainly the methods that we have used and that we use as part of the Elephant Welfare Group, which is under the umbrella of the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums. I've been working with them as part of that group for more than a decade, working in partnership with UK zoos to figure out ways to assess and improve welfare in captive elephants. But I think that the principles that we've come up with absolutely apply to any captive animal in terms of trying to figure out if they've got good welfare. But obviously, there are some specifics for each species where you need to kind of adapt what you do to accurately figure out if they have good welfare or not.
Mm-hmm. So, talking about physiology, what aspects of their physiology do you assess when trying to, for example, assess their well-being, if they're doing well or not? What aspects of their physiology do you tend to look at?
Well, one of the very common measures that is used is glucocorticoids. So glucocorticoids include the hormone cortisol or corticosterone, depending on the species that you're looking at. And cortisol is a hormone that's made by the adrenal gland in the body, and it increases under a number of different conditions. One of those conditions is stress, and so it's very commonly used to try and assess stress. But the complicating thing about cortisol is that it increases for other reasons as well, like social excitement or very intense physical activity or intense bouts of feeding behavior. And other physiological measures that can be used, that are commonly used for assessing stress, are things like heart rate or heart rate variability. But the thing is that for all of these physiological measures that we have, they can be a measure of what's called arousal, which is just excitement or intense physical activity, as well as stress. And so in order to be able to interpret the physiological measures, it's really quite important to also collect measures of behavior alongside that, because behavior will give you that sort of interpretive context to figure out if that animal was showing signs of stress or if in fact it was doing other things which might explain why the physiological indicators show that an animal was aroused in some way.
So, talking about behavior, are there specific, let's say, behavioral welfare assessment tools for elephants?
As a matter of fact, yes, we recently developed and validated a behavioral welfare assessment tool for elephants. There wasn't anything like that existing at the time. And the challenge is that there are a lot of people that study behavior or want to study behavior as a way of evaluating welfare, which is absolutely a good thing to do. But it's really important to ensure that the tools that you use are ones that have been scientifically validated. Because if you don't validate it, you don't really know if it's measuring what you think it's measuring. So we did validate as much as possible our behavioral welfare assessment tool. And the tool that we created was something that was designed to be used by the people that are working with the elephants every day, so elephant keepers or mahouts or veterinarians. And the idea is not to be able to necessarily compare one elephant to another elephant, but actually to monitor the welfare of an elephant over time. So it was very much designed to be used as a regular and routine part of assessing an elephant's well-being. And it's by doing that, you can see what changes have happened to the elephant over time.
Mm-hmm. So could you give us perhaps one or two examples of behaviors that you assess that might point to that particular elephant being well or not doing well, for example?
Sure, yeah, there are a number. Actually, one of it depends very much on the species, but for elephants, we know that in the wilds, they would feed and forage for about 16 to 18 hours of their day, which is quite a lot of their day. And so we would look to see if elephants in captivity are doing similarly. And in general, what we would tend to do is, as I talked about before, we'll actually compare our captive elephants to elephants in the wild and what their behaviors are like and how they spend their day. So we'd look at, for example, their social behaviors. Are they fighting a lot? Are they not getting along with the other elephants there? Or in fact, are they engaged in a lot of more positive social behaviors like play behavior, for example? We'd look at things like sleep behavior. Are they sleeping? Are they sleeping not enough or maybe more than they would normally sleep in the wild, which can point to other issues? We would look at things like the expression of a behavior called stereotypy. And a stereotypy is an abnormal repetitive behavior. So it's something that captive animals do sometimes. It seems to be something that they will do under conditions of stress. It can be something that happened in the past, or it can be something that's going on right now. But we do know that elephants or other animals in the wild don't express these stereotypies. And so it seems to be some kind of a result of something that we're doing to them when they're in captivity.
So you usually compare their behavior to how they usually behave in the wild. Is that it?
Well, it's something that can be done, but actually with our tool, it doesn't require that you compare the elephant's behavior to any other elephant, because what we do know about animal welfare is that it is very much something that is down to the individual rather than something that's necessarily going to be the case similar across individuals. So for example, you could have 10 elephants in a zoo, and each of those 10 elephants will be experiencing their environment differently, and each of them therefore will have different welfare. And so our tool was designed so that each elephant basically serves as its own baseline. So you're just comparing that animal to itself to see how its behavior changes over time.
So perhaps elephants also have personalities.
Oh, I think yes. We sometimes get criticized for calling it personalities in animals. So we tend to use the phrase that they have consistent behavioral traits. But more or less, yes, I think that it's fair to say that elephants, like every other animal that we're aware of, have personalities for sure.
Mm-hmm. So, but talking about the goals of captive elephant management, what are they? I mean, what are you trying to accomplish here?
I think that probably varies from institution to institution and country to country. But I think for most places that you speak to will say that they are trying to raise awareness with the public, that they are trying making them more aware of the issues that relate to elephant conservation and the fact that they are all now endangered in the wild. So Asian elephants have been endangered since 1986, but African elephants since 2021 are now also endangered. And that means that they are dying out in the wild, that there are more of them dying than there are being born. And so we think probably in the next few decades, if not sooner, we will cease to have elephants in the wild. And so what this means is that the elephants that we have in captivity may well be the only elephants that we have in the future. And so I think that everybody recognizes that it's really important that we get better at managing them in captivity, and that we hopefully can get them breeding and use them as a conservation resource. And ultimately, if we can figure out how to improve the survival of elephants in the wild, we might be able to bring them back. So I guess in a sense, the captive population is a bit of an insurance against the future need to try and repopulate elephants in the wild.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, endangered here, because many people are not familiar with this specific nomenclature. So endangered here means on the verge of extinction. Is that it?
Yes, more or less. Yes, what it means is that they're going to become extinct unless we do something different. And I guess I will say, in further response to your last question regarding why we have elephants in captivity, it really does vary quite a bit depending on the facility. So in zoos and wildlife parks and in tourist camps, part of it is as an interest, something interesting that the public likes to see or likes to experience. A lot of the tourist camps in range countries, it's a source of livelihood, of income for the people that have them, but also increasingly they are also trying to deliver a conservation message as well. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I think I got sidetracked with that, and I'm not quite sure I answered your most recent question.
No, you did, but I mean, so it's not always the case that elephants are kept in captivity with conservation in mind, right?
I think probably not always, although I think increasingly everybody in many different settings is recognizing that having them in captivity can be a bit of an insurance policy. But the truth is actually that even our captive populations at the moment are also endangered in the sense that they are not self-sustaining, that those animals are also dying out at a higher rate than they're being born into captivity. So in both contexts, we just need to do better, because otherwise we're going to lose elephants entirely.
But I mean, particularly when they are kept in zoos and other conservation facilities, I mean, the facilities where they are kept with their conservation in mind specifically, would it be one of the goals for somewhere in the future if, for example, we are able to increase their population density to release them again, or not?
That's very much the hope, yes. It would depend on a few different things, hopefully different factors being in place. One is that we have removed the threats that currently exist for elephants in the wild. Otherwise, we would just be releasing them to have them die out again. And the problem for elephants in the wild is it's a few things. It's all our fault, essentially. One thing is that we've been cutting down their habitat so that we can farm and for people to live in. And so there's less and less space for elephants to live in. And the habitat that's remaining has been so chopped up and is so disconnected that it is really difficult for the elephants. And so there's a lot of human-elephant conflict in range countries where elephants are living in the wild. And the other thing is that poaching is a huge threat to elephant populations worldwide. And for whatever reason, over the last 10 years and more, it's just skyrocketed. And we don't entirely understand why, but it has really decimated the African elephants as well as the Asian ones.
And do you know if some of that could also be the result of climate change or not?
But potentially it could, perhaps indirectly, because it might be that people are encroaching more on elephant habitat because some of the other habitat isn't as habitable for them and for domestic animals as it used to be. But sadly, we don't even need to have climate change for all of the devastating impacts that we're having on elephant habitat.
I was also thinking when it comes to potentially releasing them in the wild, I mean, it's also an issue if some of them were born and brought up in captivity because they might not adapt to their wildlife environment, right?
It's potentially a concern, and there are efforts in some facilities that are hoping to release the elephants to try and introduce them to some of the things that they need to be aware of to encourage them to forage more. But we don't know socially how they'll fit in. If there are other elephants that are already there, obviously that becomes complex because they won't necessarily know how to interact with wild elephants and they won't necessarily get along with them. Although the great thing is, hopefully, if there is that space available to them, they can do what elephants will naturally do. If they don't get along well with another elephant, they'll disperse. They'll go in different directions. So they have the flexibility to do that.
Mm-hmm. So tell us now, what is a One Health approach? What does that mean exactly?
So One Health is a concept which looks more holistically at humans and animals and the environment, and it looks at the intersection between those three areas of concern. And the idea is that they are all interconnected. So the things that we are doing which devastate the environment will ultimately have an impact on wildlife, on domestic animals, and on us. And when we think about it from the standpoint of infectious diseases, for example, and this is done quite commonly, that we're increasingly aware of the fact that about 6 out of 10 of every known emerging infectious disease probably comes from animals originally. And of those, about 3/4 of them have actually come from wildlife. And so if we think about it from an infectious disease standpoint, as we are chopping down the habitat that wildlife live in, they're increasingly coming into closer and closer contact with human populations and with domestic animals. And so there's that increased chance for transmission of infectious diseases, of bacteria or viruses or fungal diseases that the wildlife have. They can be transmitted either indirectly to humans through their domestic animals or directly if they come in contact with humans. So for example, if people are out doing subsistence hunting, they're more likely to come into contact with wildlife. Or if they're living in a range country where there is a lot of wildlife and they are out there creating farmland for their livestock, they will come into increasing contact with wildlife as well. And there's another aspect of One Health which is not related to infectious disease, but for example, if we think about pollutants, so if we're going out into the wild and people are spraying after they chop down the habitat, they're then spraying chemicals to try and keep the crops, the plants healthy. Those chemicals then get into the water, into the groundwater, enter the rivers and streams, and they can then have a devastating impact on wildlife. Or through mining, as we bring more and more toxic metals like lead or cadmium or zinc to the surface, it then is more likely to spread around the environment. It then can affect wildlife, killing them off, but also it can affect people and can really have adverse health effects on people as well. And so in those kinds of cases, sometimes we can use animals as sentinels, as indicators of what's out there and some of the threats to us as well.
So, I mean, if I understand it correctly, this approach also puts an emphasis on the fact that as animal species, we are all sort of interconnected, right? I mean, if something affects wildlife or domestic animals, it will probably also end up affecting humans in some way.
Yes, exactly. And I guess one of the things that often gets overlooked when we talk about One Health is also the environment itself. The ecosystem
Yeah.
is a big part of that. And as you say, humans are just another animal, and we are part of that ecosystem, but it is all interconnected, and the things that we do have ramifications all across that web of connections.
So, by studying, for example, the effects of environmental pollutants on wildlife health, I mean, can we follow, for example, the effect that a pollutant has on a wild species, and then how it goes all over from them to us, humans? Is that possible?
Yes, yes, in some cases, yes. And in fact, we recently published a study by one of my PhD students looking at the impact of these toxic metals from former lead mines in Wales. And we looked at the effects in wildlife, but also found that domestic chickens that were being kept on this land were getting affected by the lead, and that lead was going into their eggs and would then pose a threat to human health.
And I mean that can be done with many animals, wild or domestic, that we consume, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. It can have a direct impact on those animals and their health, but it can also then kind of move up the food chain, as it were, and also affect the people.
Can we also use this approach to study something like the bioaccumulation of contaminants across different trophic levels?
Yes, very much so. And it's something that I think is well, we're certainly finding it in our research, and I think it's increasingly being recognized. So we started out looking in the rivers and the environment, and then looking at invertebrates. So things like the little flies and the larvae of those flies, and the water mayfly and caddisfly. But then also looking at fish, or on land, looking at the small mammals like field voles, bank voles, and wood mice. But then looking at one level up from that. So from our rivers, we go from invertebrates to fish to animals like otters, the apex predators, or on land, if we're looking at the lead mines, looking at the effects on birds that are eating those small mammals, and how that then can get accumulated up through the trophic levels. And so again, the example that I was talking about with the eggs coming from those chickens. So obviously the chickens themselves are having to deal with these very high levels of lead, but then the lead ends up in the eggs that they're laying, and then people consume those eggs that have those high levels of lead. And so we do get that accumulation up the different trophic levels.
Yeah, I guess that this is a very important approach to tell people about, to raise awareness of the fact that, okay, sometimes people think that we are just polluting the rivers, the sea, and all of that. And I mean, it will only just affect the wildlife there, but that's not really the case, because if we consume the fish, or we consume other animals that consume the fish, and so on and so forth, that might end up having health effects in humans, right?
Absolutely. If we think of it just purely from a selfish standpoint, yes, ultimately we could end up being very directly affected by, as you say, eating the fish, for example, or eating the eggs that have been laid by the chickens. So yes, without a doubt, it comes directly back to haunt us, as it were. Our own misdeeds are going to directly impact us. And so it's not just about thinking about, oh, it's wrong to do this for the sake of the animals or for the environment, but actually directly it's probably going to have an impact on us. And we see that very much with our use of various pesticides, that they're affecting the pollinator species, so the die-off of the bees, which is going to have an impact, again, not just on the wildlife and all the animals that are depending on that of the food chain, but also they're not going to be able to pollinate the crops that we're growing. And so again, if we're thinking about it from a very selfish standpoint, it is still going to not end well for us if we carry on as we're doing, and don't change our activities.
In that particular case of bees, it can have I mean, down the road, it can have very severe effects on agriculture, right?
Yes, exactly. So if we kill off the pollinators like bees, then the bees are not available to spread the pollen and for the crops to be successful. We very much rely on those pollinators, and if we're killing them with our insecticides, then it's going to be a real problem for food production. And in the face of things like climate change, which obviously is already creating challenging conditions for raising crops or for these wild animals to survive. But as we become more and more reliant on being able to grow our food in these different environments, as the environments change, and as we're also killing off our pollinators, it's going to get harder and harder for us to produce the food that we need to feed our growing world population.
Right. So, as a last topic for this conversation, I would like to ask you a little bit more about zoonotic pathogens. So, you also mentioned that when I asked you about the One Health approach. So, could you tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing on ecological drivers for the emergence of zoonotic pathogens?
Yes, so that work is actually in partnership with a whole range of different people from the UK, working with soil geochemists and working with an ecologist who looks at stream health, river health, and working with medics from the UK, and then also with ecologists and agricultural researchers. And NGOs out in Brazil, in the Brazilian Pantanal. And we're in the process of developing a project right now, which looks at essentially the different human activities that we have ongoing. And this is something that is repeated over and over in many different places in the world, that we are destroying the habitat, as I mentioned, for many wild animals. And as a result of that and increasing human encroachment into their habitat, it's a huge source of stress for those animals, and they are struggling to get access to food, and they're very, very, very stressed by increased human presence and the presence of their domestic animals in their habitat. And that stress makes them more susceptible to disease. We know that. We know that it affects the white blood cells, the cells in the body that are used to fight off infection. Those are decreased in the face of stress. And so these animals are more susceptible to disease, including diseases that could potentially be passed on to humans. And at the same time, we see humans increasingly pushing into the environment where wild animals are living. And so humans and their domestic animals are coming into closer contact with this wildlife. So given the fact that we already know that 6 out of every 10 emerging infectious diseases comes from animals, and 3/4 of those particularly come from wild animals, it seems like a perfect recipe for creating new emerging zoonotic diseases that could be transmitted to people. And I think we've just seen in the past few years in the world that this is something that we really do need to be concerned about. And it's not just we who have identified this issue. It's being talked about more and more by a lot of different people. It's something finally we're waking up to, but it's really sad that it's taken a worldwide pandemic to raise that awareness.
Yeah, I was going to mention the pandemic because, as far as we know, I mean, according to the best evidence we have, if I'm up to date about it, this recent novel coronavirus was a zoonotic pathogen as well. I mean, it came from some other species, right?
Yes, I think you're right that the information seems to be something we're still trying to get to the bottom of in terms of its origin, but it is absolutely shown to be the case that it's a virus that not only can affect humans, it can affect quite a few other different animal species, and it could well have originated in animals, but I guess that the final conclusion is yet to be reached on that. But certainly there are many, many examples. The first SARS virus did come from animals. Ebola has come from animals. And we could point to many, many other diseases that have also come from animals. So I think it's safe to say that it is certainly a risk, and it's something that we're increasingly risking if we don't change what we're doing.
Right. So, Dr. Yon, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Oh, yes, please. I would certainly welcome anybody who would like to visit our Elephant Welfare Project website, which is at elephantwelfareproject, all is one word, .org. And you're also welcome to find my webpage at the University of Nottingham Vet School.
Okay, great. So, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. And look, I think the work you're doing is very important. So, thank you so much for that as well. And it's been a real pleasure to everyone.
Oh, my pleasure as well. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. You will find links to it in the description box of this interview. And also, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Ernst Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Castle, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Kloaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DR PMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zoll, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, and Chris Story. A special thanks to my producers Isa Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Trumple, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrean, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.